want to start with a confession. I used to think that if I could just explain myself well enough, if I could find the perfect words, the right tone, the best timing, then people would understand me, really understand me. And if they understood me, they wouldn't judge me. They wouldn't misunderstand my choices. They wouldn't think I was too much or not enough. But here's what I learned the hard way. Explaining yourself doesn't guarantee understanding. And complaining just leaves you feeling more stuck in the thing you were complaining about in the first place. Yet, we do it all the time. We over-explain when we feel insecure. We complain when we feel powerless. And somehow, both of those habits keep us trapped in seeking validation, trapped in resentment, trapped in narratives that don't serve us. So today we're talking about what happens when we let go of both, when we stop complaining and stop explaining, not to be cold, not to shut people out, but to step into something deeper, clarity, courage, and self-trust. I used to think complaining was just harmless venting, the kind of thing you do when you're stuck in traffic, when your coffee's cold, when someone in the office sends an email that really could have been a text. Complaining felt like a release, like if I just said the thing out loud, it would somehow be less frustrating. But here's what I realized. I wasn't just complaining about little things. I was rehearsing my frustrations over and over. And the more I complained about the same things, work stress, feeling overcommitted, how tired I was, the more stuck I felt in them. One day, a friend looked at me and said, "Okay, but what are you going to do about it?" And listen, I did not appreciate that question in the moment because I wasn't trying to do anything about it. I was just trying to be heard. I wanted someone to say, "Oh my gosh, that's so unfair. You're totally right." I wanted validation, not a solution. But that question stuck with me. And the more I thought about it, the more I saw the pattern. Complaining made me feel like I was taking action when I really wasn't. It was like rocking in a chair. I was moving, but I wasn't going anywhere. Here's the hard truth. Complaining keeps us in the passenger seat. It makes us feel like life is just happening to us, like we have no control, no agency. And when we do it often enough, it starts to shape our story. Instead of saying, "This situation is frustrating," we start saying, "I am frustrated." Instead of "This is unfair," it becomes, "Nothing ever goes my way." Complaints start as observations, but if we repeat them long enough, they become identity statements. And the really tricky part, complaining bonds us to other people. We form entire relationships around mutual frustration, about work, about family, about how no one seems to know how to properly load a dishwasher. And there's something comforting about that, right? Because if I'm complaining to you, it means I trust you enough to share what's bothering me. But when the foundation of connection is built on shared negativity, what happens when things get better? What happens when you decide to make a change, but the other person wants to stay in the cycle? I remember being at dinner with a group of friends, and at some point the conversation turned into a full-blown complaint fest. Work stress, annoying coworkers, how expensive everything was getting. I was right there with them, nodding, adding my own grievances to the mix. But then one friend, someone who's usually pretty quiet, said, "I actually started setting better boundaries at work, and it's helped a lot. I'm not as drained as I used to be." And I kid you not, the whole table got quiet. Like, why wasn't she miserable with us? Why wasn't she reinforcing the story we were all telling? And the silence made me realize something. Sometimes we don't just complain to be heard. We complain because it confirms the story we're comfortable with. And if someone chooses to step out of that story, it forces us to ask ourselves if we're really as stuck as we think we are. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying we should never express frustration. We need space to process, to let things out. Holding everything in isn't strength. It's just another kind of avoidance. But there's a difference between acknowledging a problem and setting up camp in it. So here's the shift. Instead of just complaining, we can start listening to what our complaints are telling us. If we're always complaining about being tired, maybe it's not just about needing more sleep. Maybe it's about needing different boundaries. If we're always complaining about feeling unappreciated, maybe it's time to ask whether we're setting clear expectations in our relationships. If we're always complaining about being too busy, maybe we need to sit with the discomfort of saying no. Because at the end of the day, complaints are just data points. They're little signals trying to tell us where we're out of alignment. But if we never take the next step, if we never move from awareness to action, we stay stuck in the story where we're just along for the ride. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live my life as a passenger. I used to believe that if I could explain myself clearly enough, if I could lay out my reasoning in a way that made perfect sense, then people would understand me. They wouldn't question my decisions. They wouldn't make assumptions. They wouldn't judge me. And most importantly, they wouldn't be disappointed in me. So I explained. I over-explained. I gave long-winded justifications for things that didn't actually need justifications. If I turned down an invitation, I'd offer a detailed breakdown of my schedule. If I made a decision someone didn't agree with, I'd go out of my way to make sure they got it, as if understanding would automatically lead to approval. And if I set a boundary, I couldn't just say no. I had to write a dissertation on why it made sense for me to say no. And let me tell you something. This is exhausting. It's like trying to hand out permission slips for your own life, hoping other people will sign off on them. But here's what I've learned. Explaining can be a disguise for seeking permission. And when we constantly explain ourselves, what we're really saying is, I need you to validate this choice for me. We're handing over our sense of self-trust to someone else, waiting for them to say, yes, that makes sense, you're allowed to do that. But the hard truth, sometimes people will never say that. Sometimes they won't get it. Sometimes they won't agree. And that has to be okay. I remember the first time I made a decision and didn't explain myself. It was a small thing. I turned down a project at work because I knew I was already stretched too thin. Normally I would have given a long, detailed reason why, but instead I just said, I appreciate the opportunity, but I can't take this on right now. And then I stopped talking. And do you know what happened? Nothing. No one demanded an explanation. No one pressed me for more details. They just said, okay. And I sat there, stunned, realizing how many times I had been offering justifications no one had even asked for. That was a wake-up call. Because the truth is, most people aren't waiting for an explanation. We're the ones who feel like we have to give one. And why? Because we want to be understood. Because we don't want to disappoint anyone. Because we don't want people to think we're selfish or rude or inconsiderate. But here's the tricky part. Even when we do explain ourselves, it doesn't always work. Think about a time when you did lay it all out, when you carefully articulated your reasons for making a decision, hoping it would make someone see things your way. Did it change their mind? Did it make them say, I completely understand now, you're totally right? Maybe. But more often than not, when people don't agree with a choice we've made, no amount of explanation is going to change that. And sometimes explanations actually hurt us. When we over-explain, we give people more material to pick apart. We invite more debate, more opinions, more opportunities for someone to poke holes in our reasoning. And before we know it, we're caught in a cycle, explaining, defending, justifying, when we could have just stood in our decision with confidence. Now, I'm not saying we should never explain ourselves. There are times when it's important, when communication and context matter, when clarity helps relationships thrive. But there's a difference between offering clarity and pleading our case. There's a difference between explaining to connect and explaining to convince. So here's the challenge. The next time you feel the urge to over-explain, pause. Ask yourself, am I explaining because I want to or because I feel like I have to? Am I looking for understanding or am I looking for permission? Because when you truly trust your own choices, you don't need everyone else to. I remember the first time someone told me no is a complete sentence. I nodded like I understood, like I was totally on board with that level of confidence and clarity. But internally, my brain was already rewriting the sentence. No, but here's why. No, but I hope you're not mad. No, but I feel bad about it. And I need you to know that. Because saying no without an explanation, that felt harsh, cold, unkind, like I was shutting a door without even peeking through the window to see if I could still make it work. I didn't just want to say no. I wanted to make sure the other person felt okay about me saying no. I wanted to soften the edges, to wrap my boundary in a warm, fluffy justification so that no one would think I was selfish, unhelpful, or worse, difficult. But here's the thing, boundaries don't come with an instruction manual. And the people who get frustrated by your boundaries, they're often the ones who benefited from you not having any. I learned this the hard way. For years, I prided myself on being the person who could always make it work. You needed a favor? I got you. Last minute request? No problem. Emotional support at 11:30 p.m.? I'm wide awake. I was the yes person, the dependable one. And on the surface, that felt good. It felt like love. It felt like belonging. But underneath, resentment, exhaustion, the quiet, creeping feeling that I was betraying myself in 100 small ways just to keep other people comfortable. I told myself I was being generous, that it was just who I was. But real generosity doesn't come from depletion. It comes from fullness. And I was running on empty. So I started practicing boundaries, messy, awkward, guilt-ridden boundaries, the kind where I'd say no, but immediately follow up with a long-winded explanation, hoping that if I just explained well enough, the other person wouldn't be upset. And then one day I caught myself. I had just turned down something I knew I didn't have the bandwidth for, but instead of simply saying no, I gave this long apologetic speech about how busy I was, how I wished I could help, how maybe if things changed I could reconsider. And by the end of it, the other person just smiled and said, "It's fine, you could have just said no." And I realized I was the one making this complicated. I was the one assuming that my boundary needed a footnote, a disclaimer, a please still like me clause. But boundaries don't need to be justified to be valid. They don't require a dissertation or a PowerPoint presentation. They just require clarity. And listen, I get it. Some people will push back. Some people will ask for the explanation because they're used to having access to your time, your energy, your constant yes. And in those moments, it's tempting to fall back into old habits, to over-explain, to make it softer, to make it easier. But every time you set a boundary, you're teaching people how to treat you. You're showing them, this is what I can give, this is what I can't. And that has nothing to do with how much I love you. Boundaries are not walls. They are not acts of rejection. They are choices that honor your capacity, your peace, and your well-being. And the people who truly respect you, they won't need the long explanation. They'll just respect the boundary. I used to think of complaining as just venting, like shaking a can of soda and slowly letting the fizz out so it doesn't explode. And sometimes it is helpful. Sometimes we just need to say, this is hard, and have someone nod and say, yeah, it really is. That kind of acknowledgement is human. It connects us. It reminds us we're not alone. But then there's the other kind of complaining, the kind that starts as venting but turns into a habit, a loop, the kind where you're saying the same things over and over to different people in different ways, but nothing changes. And I know this kind really well because I used to do it a lot. I would complain about being too busy, but I was the one saying yes to everything. I would complain about feeling unseen, but I wasn't asking for what I needed. I would complain about feeling exhausted, but I wasn't setting boundaries around my time. At some point, I realized I wasn't just venting. I was outsourcing my discomfort. I was looking for sympathy when what I really needed was clarity. Because here's the thing, Complaints are data. They are little red flags waving in the wind, trying to tell us something. But instead of listening, we get stuck talking about them. Instead of asking, why does this keep coming up for me? We stay in the cycle of, can you believe this is happening again? And I get it, change is hard. It's easier to sit in what's familiar, even if it's frustrating, than to do the work of shifting something. Complaining feels productive. It feels like we're doing something, but venting about how overwhelmed we are isn't the same as making a plan to change it. I had a friend once who always complained about her job. Every conversation, there was something. Her boss, the workload, the lack of appreciation. And at first, I was right there with her, validating every frustration. But after a while, I started asking, so what are you going to do about it? And she'd say, I don't know, it's just the way things are. But was it? Was it just the way things were? Or was it the way she was choosing to stay? And listen, this is not about toxic positivity. This is not about pretending things don't suck when they do. Life is hard. Things are unfair. There are real challenges that we don't always have control over. But what we do have control over is what we do with that frustration. So the next time you catch yourself complaining, really catch yourself. Pause. Ask yourself, is this something I can change? If the answer is yes, then the next step is action. And if the answer is no, then the next step is acceptance. Because if something is within your control, it deserves action, not endless frustration. And if it's outside of your control, then it doesn't deserve to steal your peace. Complaints are messages. They are trying to tell us where we're out of alignment. They are trying to show us what we need to shift. But if we ignore them, if we just keep repeating them instead of listening to them, we stay stuck in the same story. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to keep reading the same chapter of a book that I have the power to rewrite. I used to believe that if I could just explain myself well enough, if I could lay out my reasons in a way that was clear, logical, and maybe even a little charming, then people would understand me. They wouldn't question my choices. They wouldn't make assumptions. They wouldn't judge me. And most importantly, they wouldn't be disappointed in me. So I explained. I over-explained. I tried to control how people saw me by offering up justifications, even when no one was asking for them. If I turned down an invitation, I'd give a detailed breakdown of my schedule. If I set a boundary, I'd cushion it with apologies. If I made a decision someone didn't agree with, I'd bend over backward to make sure they got it, as if their understanding somehow made my choice more valid. And let me tell you, this is exhausting. It's like constantly handing out permission slips for your own life, waiting for other people to sign off on them. But here's the hard truth. No matter how well you explain yourself, some people still won't understand. Some people will choose not to understand because it's easier for them to hold on to their own version of the story. Some people will take your choices personally, even when they have nothing to do with them. And if you're constantly trying to manage how other people perceive you, you'll spend your whole life performing instead of actually living. I learned this in a really uncomfortable way. There was a time in my life when I said yes to everything. I prided myself on being the person who was always available, always accommodating, always willing to go the extra mile, and then one day I hit a wall. I was burned out, overwhelmed, and deeply resentful. Not because other people had taken advantage of me, but because I had trained them to expect my constant yes. So I started saying no. I started setting boundaries. I started making choices that prioritized my well-being. And let me tell you, some people did not like that. I got pushback, I got questions, I got guilt trips. And my first instinct, explain. Justify. Try to make them okay with my decisions. Until I realized my job is not to make other people comfortable with my boundaries. My job is to honor what I know is right for me. And here's the thing. People who respect you don't need an elaborate explanation. They don't need you to prove why your decision is valid. They just trust that if you're saying no, you have a good reason. They trust that you're taking care of yourself in a way that's best for you. And the people who don't respect that, no amount of explaining will ever be enough. I think we underestimate how much power there is in simply owning our choices, in saying this is what works for me, and not feeling the need to wrap it up in a 10-minute justification. In letting go of the fear that if people don't understand, then maybe we've done something wrong. You don't owe anyone an explanation for taking care of yourself. You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace over people-pleasing. And you definitely don't owe anyone an explanation for the decisions that allow you to show up as the healthiest, fullest version of yourself. Because at the end of the day, the people who truly see you, the ones who truly care, they don't need an explanation. They just need you to be you. So here's the invitation. What happens when you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't really listening? What happens when you stop complaining and start making the changes you can control? Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to be understood by everyone. The goal is to understand yourself enough that you don't need to be